all of us by a certain stage have lost more battles than we've won, even people that look successful.
One signal that tells you that somebody will keep growing in their career?
Without curiosity, you can't continue growing, I think. As far as I can tell, some people are born with it. People develop professional skills during their personal lives as well. Yeah. Challenges you go through, or the experience of having a family, or all kinds of things actually transform the way that you conduct yourself. And I sit with clients and I say kind of like, are you crazy? Would you want to do the same job 2-3 times? Surely you want to do the next level up. A lot of my clients say, no, we want someone who's tried and tested at this level. Sideways move would be better. In the UK labour market, I think it's a real problem because we should be trying to skip a generation. We should be aggressively trying to bring new blood and new thinking into these roles. What's happened in the UK, it's really, really complicated. 5-7 decades of feminism, which have really improved the way that people understand gender balance in the workplace. And there have been some really significant changes. This is going to sound terrible, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is an expectation that for a woman to be successful, you have to put a lot of work into keeping everybody around you happy. You have to kind of keep the boss happy, if you like.
One quality that you think can compensate for lack of experience?
Get your head around how important it is to fail. Unless you fail, you'll never succeed.
Good evening, everyone. Ben, welcome to FIIB once again. I have a question to ask of the audience. How many of you think that if you work hard, if you perform well, if you build expertise, then your career is all set and you're going to go places? Just raise your hand if you feel that. Lovely. I think all of us at some level have believed that narrative, and some of it is true. But there were some people who didn't raise their hands. I couldn't but notice that they happen to be sitting in the front row. They happen to be people who have more experience than the people in terms of number of years than the people who are sitting behind them. And I hope the discussion is as relevant for them today as it is for the people sitting in the second row and bit beyond. At FIIB, we've always loved talking about what's next. Whether it was FIIBX or our other conversations, we love talking about what happens next. This conversation is really about what happens after the next. So what we are talking today is not something that you need for your first job, to be honest, everybody sitting in the room. It's not something that's going to help you build capabilities in that first assignment that you take up. But I think the conversation is going to stay with you for many years. This is a conversation that will hit you when you are thinking 15, 16 years from today about how do you enter that leadership role, or how do you start thinking about a board level position. And great that you're prepping for it today, and nobody else better than Ben for you to do it for us, because you've had a front row seat to a lot of these conversations. I'm going to just straight jump into it, Ben. And I'm going to say you've advised on so many appointments for CEOs, vice-chancellors, board members. When these decisions are being made in the closed room, what separates the people who get chosen from the ones who don't get chosen? Are you seeing anything common?
Sure. Actually, I think this is a really interesting question. And there are two parts in my thinking. First of all, maybe a bit of a surprise to you, but most of the time, the hiring of a chief executive will be done by a subset of a board. And there is a belief, there's a kind of nonsense in organizations that boards know what they're doing. And actually, they don't. Most of the time, people who are sitting on non-executive boards have imposter syndrome. Most of the time, they don't really, they're aware of the fact that they don't really understand the business or the organization that they're presiding over. And if you're lucky and you're being interviewed by a board that has humility, that has taken real time to attend to its responsibilities and to understand the business, you have a chance that they will make a sensible and rational decision. Very often I sit with panels at the end of interviews, and I'm struck by how arbitrary their decision is, how, as they're talking about candidates, they will use exactly the same logic in favor of one candidate that they will then use against another candidate. And none of them sitting around the table, even people with PhDs or with postgraduate degrees, will realize that they're kind of using this logic in different ways about different candidates. And so actually the first thing is, when you find yourselves being interviewed for chief executive roles in 15 or 20 years time, if you don't get one, it probably has as much to do with the people who are interviewing you and what their perspective is as it has to do with you. So the really important thing is to get as much feedback as you can and reflect if you're unsuccessful, but don't take it to heart, because it may not say anything about you at all. Secondly, the ability to get the job is really, really dependent upon how well you can perform in an interview. And this remains the case throughout your career. We can maybe come on to talk a bit more about this, but one of the things I've come to see now, having sat in interview candidates for nearly 30 years, is essentially I'm asking the same set of 4 or 5 questions of every candidate. And if you're preparing for interviews later in life, you possibly want to think about a quick narrative that you can give to each of these questions. And a quick narrative where you give quantitative examples of what the difference was before you started and then the difference you made. But one question that we're asking everybody is kind of, what has been your strategic contribution? What has been the difference you've made? Where have you spotted an opportunity to transform your organization or do something different? And give a really clear example of what difference that made. Secondly, and this is maybe a similar question, but often shapes itself slightly differently, which is around change. And perhaps when I started in my career, this was less of a topic, but there's never a single role now where we're recruiting to where it isn't about change. It's always about preparing an organization for the next stage or to perform better in its market. So strategic contribution, change. The third question is always around leadership of people, and have really good examples to hand about how you've developed a team. Showing that you have the courage to hire and work with people who you think are better than you is a really important quality. But also increasingly is being able to show that you really have the courage to deal with poor performance. I think increasingly leaders have got to show that they can have difficult conversations with people, that they can find humane ways of dealing with poor performance, because everywhere we look, it's harder and harder to carry people who aren't performing. And then I think this is in no order of importance, but the other question that we ask is about communication skills, and it's about essentially it's about selling. If I'm honest, there isn't a single leadership role where you don't spend a lot of your time selling. And so having good examples of where you've sold propositions and where you've won people over, I think are really important. So sort of strategy change, team building, and selling.
Got that. I think any of the faculty members teaching leadership probably resonated with you, right? The level of the impact or the strategic change, the strategic impact initiatives, that changes, but they're probably all relevant for all levels. But at leadership, I think 2-3 things really resonated with me. One, the working with people and the difficult conversation, that the dealing with not desired level of performance is something that, yes, probably good leaders are able to do very well. And that interesting to see that is sifted through in that discussion in the boardroom. But we're going to do this fireside chat a little different. I planned it in segments. So while we're on this segment, while we're talking about this, if there are any questions right now, we can take them. Maybe 1 or 2 questions and then move to the next segment. That probably will give us the most takeaways. So we neatly tie what we're talking about now. Anybody in the room have any questions so far?
My question is, though you say, the way Radhika ma'am opened the conversation that, you work hard and you let your work speak for you. And I'm someone who totally endorse that. But when I talk about my role as a professor, I also go through research, which very clearly says there is another unseen reason which leads to promotion. There is a concept called LNX theory, which says that manager will always have an in-group and an out-group. In-group could be on the basis of similar to me bias. Okay, you both are from Delhi, high five. Okay, or we both have some, I see myself in you, and there are other XYZ reasons. And these frameworks, they still play a role as far as published research is concerned. So how do you see, when you say that, okay, yes, the work will speak for you. Of course, there is no denying the fact. Can we say, I'll simplify my question, can we say that both sides are possible? It all zeroes down to the culture of the organization.
Yes, I think we can. This may seem a bit of a strange concept, but in the UK, we have a lot of initiatives around equality, diversity, and inclusion. And in particular, I've done quite a lot of work with universities on this topic. And I work with the University of Greenwich in London, running a leadership development course for maybe about 20 people a year who are coming from what they now call global ethnic majority backgrounds, which is essentially non-white, non-British backgrounds. And what is interesting there is, first of all, we do some work with the next level up, who are mainly white people. And they're very unaware of the lived experience of people coming from different backgrounds. So they exactly have this in-group. And very clearly, I remember talking to one head of department who said it was a real shock to him when he realized that people coming from other religious backgrounds who didn't want to come to the pub on Friday afternoon were not being included in essentially all of the strategic discussions about the way that the department was going to progress. And that also excluded women, because the men, it was more acceptable for them to stay drinking beer in the pub to 7 p.m. So these are really, really big factors, I think. And organizations have to work to kind of challenge themselves on them, I think. I think it's really complex. I think sort of if we, it's a bit, it almost comes down to a choice about, like we would give up, I think, wouldn't we, if we just accepted that this is all there is. But we have to kind of empower people to fight back. I mean, I think it's such a really big issue in Britain. Like I often say to people, I think Britain feels like it's like, everywhere you look, there's like soft upholstery. All the rules are kind of put in like soft cushions around the place. And it's really off-putting to people who come from different backgrounds because there's this strange code that you have to learn to succeed. But actually very often people who just refuse to accept that it's there break through. But it takes the courage and it takes some degree of determination, I think. You kind of have to just decide this is nonsense. And it's sort of easier if you're really willing to push, I think, than people sometimes think. So I agree. Culture can be a really big problem, but we have to find ways of empowering people to challenge it, I think. Agree completely.
Ben, I do research on talent management, and I've always been fascinated with the idea of performance versus potential.
Yes.
Lots of companies use it interchangeably.
Yeah.
Wondering what's your perspective on how do organizations distinguish between the two?
I think very few organizations do it very well, actually. I think potential is really hard to measure and really hard to be confident. Even if you think you've got really good ways of doing it, it's really hard to be confident, I think. And in a way, your very first question as well, I think is also a key part of it, which is that, potential is nothing unless the person is really, really willing to put a lot of perspiration in, I think.
And that actually ends up being one of the first reasons why you get recognized as a high potential.
I think
because
you're
putting the perspiration in.
I think that's right. I also think that, from a strategic HR point of view, potential is important. But at the end of the day, most of your organizations, particularly in the first part of the career, will not really care about your potential, but they will care about the performance that you're able to display. So, however good and bright you are, it'll be simply the results that will separate you out at the start, I think. I don't know if that answers the question.
It does, but let me throw a third monkey in the system. We've got performance, we've got potential. Let me also throw readiness in there. So, somebody has potential, but then how do we know that they're ready for them to be in that next position? They performed at their level. Now they're showing potential for the next level. But how do organizations decide readiness?
Yeah. So I think there are two things that spring to mind. One is that you have to start looking at track record of, as early as the advice, I guess, in the implications of what I'm about to say are that as early as possible, people should be trying to take on additional challenges, the kind of stretch projects, because if you can demonstrate that you can take big steps up in the early stage of your career, it'll be easier for people to believe that you'll be ready to take those steps up later on. But actually, I don't know. I think in India, maybe there is more openness and there is more innovation around some of these things. But I think it's a real challenge in the UK that organizations are very, very reluctant to take a punt on people who are coming up. And a lot of I don't know if Arvind would agree with me, but a lot of the senior recruitment I'm doing is looking for people who are making sideways moves. And I sit with clients and I say kind of like, are you crazy? Like, would you want to do the same job 2-3 times? Surely you want to do the next level up. This is what motivates people to do good work. But a lot of my clients say, no, we want someone who's tried and tested at this level. Sideways move would be better. And in the UK labor market, I think it's a real problem because we should be trying to skip a generation. We should be aggressively trying to bring new blood and new thinking into these roles. So the challenge for people who are involved in leadership and leadership advisory, I think, is how do you find potential, I think.
So when we talk about sideways moves, and organizations prefer sometimes to get people sideways. For our students, what that really means is you want to get somebody in a role that is or has already been performing in that role. So if you're looking at senior manager position that's open, you want to get another senior manager from another organization rather than taking a manager and then promoting them because they've performed. They know the lines, they've delivered performances, they know the cues. I mean, they'll give you a solid stage performance. Is the thinking around it. But if we think about the development piece of developing the talent and promoting them, what are some ways in which organizations are developing leadership potential for people who have that potential? How are they developing their leadership pipelines?
Yeah, I think this is also quite a good question because I think globally, I haven't seen statistics for it, but I'm very aware of the fact that a lot of my clients have cut a lot of the resources that they've been putting into leadership development and finding this potential. And I think this is just simply a measure of the state of the global economy, which is that, this is the sort of thing that gets cut first. So, and the implication of that is that it is down to individuals to demonstrate their resourcefulness, look for opportunities, and put that extra amount in. The good organizations, I can think of some examples are, they're working hard to make sure that, particularly at mid-career stage, people are getting support, mentoring, coaching. Very often, investment in leadership happens disproportionately at the very top levels. The sort of either right at the top or the kind of maybe one level below chief executive, 1 or 2 levels. And actually, the organizations I think are doing it well are focusing on people who are kind of, let's say, mid-managers, heads of business unit. These are the people who ultimately are delivering the most change and responsible for the success of organizations, I think. But I do think that, and maybe this is just a personal view, that, and maybe this is because prior to setting my own business up, I grew up in organizations where there was very little leadership development. I do think that fundamentally, if you want to succeed, you have to take individual responsibility for it. You have to develop that self-awareness about where are my weaknesses, what can I work on, and what can I improve, I think. All professional societies around the world have I think we're still quite immature in our understanding of what it takes to be a good chair of a board as well. Like, I think we think it's obvious, but I think very often the wrong people get chosen to be chairs, which is actually where some of this starts, I think. I think for me, it's quite interesting because I think the character and the behavior of the chair of the board, similarly to the character and behavior of a chief executive, is really significant for how the culture of a business develops. And actually the change, particularly negatively, the change can be very quick. It can percolate down in a culture very, very fast, I think. It actually takes longer time, I think, to build up positively. I'm straying away from your question a bit, but I think this is part of the context of how sometimes these really kind of quite complex phenomena happen, where you can have in place a cultural initiative to, let's say, change the way that hiring is done, change the way that people behave with each other. But sometimes it's set in the DNA of the culture, or sometimes, you do have somebody at a really significant level who just is not enacting this cultural change, and it makes it impossible for the business to enact it. So we're kind of very much in the hands of the humility and the self-questioning and the holding to self-account of board members and of chief executives, I think. That kind of, people don't talk about it a lot, but I often talk about humility as being actually a really important quality, like at these levels.
And that's why you probably see a lot of proliferation of courses for preparing you to be a board member. I mean, I see a lot more conversation happening in the business school executive development program brochures, which earlier wasn't there. So it's probably something that needs training, like you said, more intentional, more mindful board members.
Yeah. And strangely, most of the training is focused on like the technical understanding you need to have, whereas actually
compliance,
but behavior is the most important thing. I think it's how you conduct yourself on the board. You can learn the compliance stuff and the technical stuff actually quite quickly, I think.
Because a lot of that has also been reactive, right? Because some boards have failed and it's exploded and become big news, and that's why it was more reactionary to set up programs and therefore talk about technical preparedness rather than the softer elements and the more important elements of board. But I'd really love for the students to get in the conversation. Anybody have a question here? Kokil, right behind you.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Myself, Aditi. So my question is, after years of leadership experience, what's that one quality you have found consistently separates high-performing professionals from the rest?
Okay. I think it is communication skills, I think. I think that ability to adapt, have a portfolio of different approaches and styles, and talk to people at all levels in the organization and in different ways, I think probably is the single biggest factor. And we've been talking today about how in this kind of new world of AI, I think this will become a particularly important quality. And I think a particularly important quality, given that we've all sort of, both younger people, but all of us, in fact, have, our concentration span is so short now. I mean, I think forget COVID, I think the pandemic is kind of an ADHD that we all have now, and scrolling on our phones and things. And we have to remember how to communicate with each other as a result of that, I think. And this will be a really important skill.
Thank you, sir.
Ben, as a school, we spoke a little bit before we came up that as a school, we're prioritizing women in leadership rather than just prioritizing women at the school. So we spend a lot of time talking about leadership, thinking about leadership pipelines and what do we need to do to have more women ready for these roles. My question to you is, what are some unique ways in which you are seeing organizations are supporting the women leadership pipeline across the kind of organizations where you're working with?
So I can across the 27 years I've done the work, it's been a really big theme. And in fact, for me, when I set Minerva up with my business partner 13 years ago, it was a really big theme. It was one of the reasons we chose a feminine name for the organization. And we set out to really prioritize having a diversity of shortlists. And in fact, since we set up, over about 52% of all the people we've appointed to senior levels have been women, which puts us like way ahead of most of our competitors in the UK. But I think that just embracing that kind of that challenge has been really important to us. I think it's really, I look at the picture and I think in terms of what's happened in the UK, it's really, really complicated because, we've now got 5-7 decades of feminism, which have really improved the way that people understand gender balance in the workplace. And there have been some really significant changes. Only 2 weeks ago, I was talking to a woman who told me that her mother, she was born in 1960, this woman, and her mother had been given half a day maternity leave from the local council that she worked for, half a day. And now in the UK, obviously you would get 6 months and things like that, but which is a big shift. But I think there's a huge amount to do in terms of employers understanding CVs of women who have taken breaks for childcare. That returning to work after 10 years is very badly understood. The selection panels are very kind of programmed to look at the sort of linear career that you would see typically in a male career path as being the right one to look for. And this is where actually your question about it's really important that panels look for potential rather than just the track record and look beyond the CV, because you have to try and look at the skills that people bring. And actually, people develop professional skills during their personal lives as well. Yeah. The challenges you go through, or the experience of having a family, or all kinds of things actually transform the way that you conduct yourself professionally as well. But I think the reality, going back to the core of your question, is I think that the UK has been better at saying the right things than it has been at kind of enacting them. We were talking just before coming in. My business partner is a woman, same age as me, and it never ceases to amaze me when she describes the way that our clients will communicate with her versus the way that they will talk to me. And it never ceases to shock me that, that actually they're ruder to her, which I think is interesting. And simply because I'm a man, it seems that they kind of afford me some level of status, which means that they're not as challenging to me, they're not as difficult. And I find it really extraordinary. But every week we have an example where we kind of reflect on this. So I don't think enough is happening. I think the real challenge is, how do we make sure we're doing things as well as saying the right things? And
that's UK. India will look even more different. Yeah. In our small leadership team, I know I've had conversations with our women leaders where they felt, the kind of questions that have come up is it okay to talk over? How do you handle a man who just completely dismisses them in meetings? So, I thought they were more India problem or a smaller setup problem, but looks like these are universal global challenges and problems. A follow-on question, because we've got more students here, is for the women students sitting in the room today, apart from getting comfortable with drinking beer in a pub at 7 p.m. What else? What would be your advice for them as they're thinking about their careers and their roles, looking at what you are seeing about the kind of biases that women are facing today? What would be your advice to them?
So this, I may get in trouble for saying this.
Go ahead. Chatham House rules. Whatever gets said here stays in this room.
So this is going to sound terrible, but I'm going to say it anyway. I've had this with women in early career women in my teams over the years, and I think there's a challenge, which is that I think my sense is that sometimes there is an expectation that for a woman to be successful, you have to put a lot of work into keeping everybody around you happy. You have to kind of keep the boss happy, if you like. And very often I would say to women who were kind of at the stage where they were moving from beyond being at the bottom level to beginning to manage client relationships and things like that. And I would sort of, trying to kind of coach them into thinking, okay, so my job now isn't to make the boss happy or to do the right thing, but actually it's about how am I going to have my own professional identity? What am I going to be like? How am I going to run my client relationships? And it's somehow there's something in the social programming that makes it more challenging for women to ask themselves that question. I think like men are encouraged to behave with a bit of swagger, and particularly in the business that Arvind and I are in, where we're selling and we're representing ourselves and our organizations to clients. We're expected to be individual people and to develop our own personas quite quickly professionally. I think somehow there's more of it can be more challenging for young women. And so I just think, as soon as you can, just be as bold as you can, I think, be nervous about people who are trying to, be nervous of the conversations where the men are speaking over you or where you're sort of being pigeonholed. There are classic things about, people will ask the women to take the notes or to pour the tea and things like that. And, just don't let yourself be put into that box, I think, because it will be difficult to get out of.
Students, your questions? Anything you'd like to ask Mr. Ben related to this? Go ahead.
So there's a difference between women having seats on the table and women having an influence over a decision.
Mm.
So how do you tackle that, and how do you see that distinction in your leadership?
Yeah. So it's a question. In my own business, because we're a 50-50 business and we've got one man and one woman, I think it's quite straightforward, except that I do sometimes think, have I listened enough? I ask myself that question a lot. I've stayed close to a lot of the women who I've worked on their appointments as sort of senior leaders, and it's interesting to kind of hear their story. And there still remains this question, which is that do you basically, in the UK, we've got the kind of Margaret Thatcher example, which is probably not many of the students will know who Margaret Thatcher was, but she was the first female British Prime Minister. She was a really strong woman. I mean, history has been very unkind to her, and she's now very unpopular. Essentially there was that thinking was, okay, for a woman to be successful, she has to basically adopt all of the kind of most aggressive behaviors of a man. And fortunately, we've seen a broadening of perspectives about different types of leadership, which means that you can find very different ways of bringing yourself to your role as a woman leader, I think. And I think we're seeing now more and more examples where leadership teams, which are very strongly female, are producing more collaborative cultures in the organizations, producing in the long run better outcomes for the organizations. So I think we're seeing more and more examples of where this works really well. But there was also one interview panel I sat in on, and the successful candidate was a woman. And she had a really, really powerful, forceful communication style. And at the end of it, this is also kind of extraordinary. The panel was entirely male, the interview panel, which I think is should never happen now for a senior leadership role. There should always be a diversity. But this all-male panel, kind of after she'd left the room, said, "I think she's amazing, but I wonder if she's a megalomaniac." And I let it happen. And I said, I just want to ask one question, which is, if we had the transcription of what she said, and I'd said this was a man that said this, would you think he was a megalomaniac, or would you think he was a strong leader? And actually, fortunately, that cornered them, because they were then, I'd then kind of exposed them, and so they then appointed her, and she was a very successful appointment. But these kind of perceptions are really, really strong and troubling, I think. So, if you excuse my language, just don't take any shit,
Ben, I've got one. While I said, what do you think the women should be doing differently? Half the room sitting here is men. What would be your advice to the men? What do they need to do differently?
So I think it's all about awareness, if I'm honest. I think it's just recognizing that, many of you will already, you'll have made this change in your thinking and the way you are expecting your lives to unfold. But if you still are holding on to these traditional ideas, then I would just encourage you to challenge yourselves as much as possible. There is a corollary problem, I think, which is that, we do have this increasing murkiness around masculine identity, and, how do we identify ourselves? What does it mean to be a man? And I don't know if there's this documentary in the UK called In the Manosphere, which was made earlier this year, where this documentary maker interviewed lots of social media influencers, and these people who are going to the gym all day and things like that, and it kind of really exposed how shallow that perception and attitude to life is. Although it's troublingly there. If I look at my own sons, and my 16 and 14-year-old who go to the gym 6 days a week, occasionally they say things, and I think, okay, this is, you need to go on a cultural awareness training program now, I think. So I think that challenging your awareness and being open to equality, and just accepting that this is going to be a really important way of making your own workplace and your own career better is really, really important, I think. The most important thing is discovering as an academic, and particularly as you take on leadership, that you have some real agency. There's one of the biggest cultural problems in higher education is the separation between being an academic and being a professional staff member, which means that you end up with academic cultures where people think, okay, we could do this, but if only the marketing department could do that, or if only central services could do that. And I think in the future, there will be less and less distinction, and academics will be expected to do more and more of getting involved in the recruitment, getting involved in the organization of placements and things like that. And it will actually, although like in the UK, for lots of academics, it will seem very culturally challenging for them, it will actually make it a much more rewarding and a much more kind of vibrant sector to be in. But you maybe already have quite an innovative culture around these things, I think.
We do. We've been very fortunate to be surrounded by a lot of global advisors, and in devising programs and policies for our faculty, especially around workload norms, kind of work, reward, etc. We've been able to come up with some good best fit practices. I'd like to think we're doing some good stuff here, but would love, at a later point in time to run by some of those. And I think there are lots of people who are responsible for policy setting at the school who might want to reach out later and maybe get some advice from you on how we are doing on those. But this does bring us to the end, Ben, but I don't want to leave you just yet. I want to ask some lightning round questions, just quick ones, but one book that you think every student in this room should be reading.
Okay, good question. Good question.
Let's expand it, or maybe a Netflix series or anything. You think one thing that every student must read, watch?
So actually, there were 2 books I read really early in my career, which will now be really unfashionable. But there's one which won't apply to everybody, but it's called Managing the Professional Services Firm. And it was by a man called David Maister. And it was I've gone back to that book so many times in terms of once I've set my own business up and thinking about it. And there's this will be seen as an absolutely terrible book. And in fact, this guy will be an emblem of all of the kind of machismo and misogynistic early thinking that we want to get away from. But what they don't teach you at Harvard Business School is still actually a really good, simple book about the kind of relationship building approach you need to have to succeed in business, particularly if you're trying to do things which are entrepreneurial. As soon as I leave the room, I'll think, actually, there's a much better example than that. But they're the 2 that came to my mind when you asked the question.
One quality that you think can compensate for lack of experience?
So hard work is there, but actually, I think maybe the most important thing is just get your head around how important it is to fail, and just that all of us by a certain stage have lost more battles than we've won, even people that look successful. And it's just really important to get a thick skin about it, learn, keep on going back in, unless you fail, you'll never succeed, I think.
One signal that tells you that somebody will keep growing in their career?
I think any evidence of curiosity, curiosity about anything. I think you can, if you have it about one thing, you probably have it about everything. And as far as I can tell, some people are born with it, others aren't. But I think this is without curiosity, you can't continue growing, I think.
You've seen a lot of exceptional leaders. One habit that you have found common across most of these people?
So again, I think it's the communication, and I think it's I've written a piece on this recently. It's kind of changed in the last 10 years or so, because when a lot of the organizations I work for are much more financially challenged than they were 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, the talk was all about authentic leadership, and it was all about how can you bring yourself to to what you express to your teams as a leader. And now I think it's much less about, now I think that somehow looks a bit like a performance. And actually, a lot of the leaders I'm working with now are having to deliver very difficult messages. They're looking at downsizing bits of the organization. And actually, it's much more about how do you kind of stand up. The story of the emperor's new clothes, where the emperor's naked and everybody starts laughing because they have no clothes on. And a lot of the leaders I'm working with now are kind of saying, well, they're sort of admitting, they're saying, I've got no clothes, but no one's got any clothes now. And there's something about that kind of frankness and honesty, which I think it's the communication and integrity around it, I think.
Thank you so much, Ben. This has been a very engaging conversation. Personally, I've really enjoyed it. Like I said in the beginning, I think this is a conversation that will hit you what after the next after the next. But I'm so glad we had this conversation, equally valuable for the students as much as for the faculty and the non-teaching professionals in the room, equally valuable for the more experienced and the less experienced early career students in the room. So thank you for making it so enriching.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciate.